It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Craig Kapitas, contributing editor to The Daily Beast, is with us. How are you, sir?
Okay, mon capitaine.
Glad to see you. Glad to see Stacey Meachtree, Paris bureau chief for The Wall Street Journal. How have you been?
Good. Glad to be here.
We're in the company of Laurent Thomé, senior economics editor for the French news agency AFP. Good Friday. You have the day off.
Great Friday, yeah.
Great Friday, okay. Is it a great Friday for Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com?
TGIF.
TGIF. By the way, you can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. In between a build-up that lasted days and a debrief that, well, is still ongoing in some parts, Donald Trump walked into a Manhattan courthouse Tuesday to become the first ever criminally indicted former U.S. president. It was Stacey Meachtree. We're still wondering if what happened was historic or an anecdote.
Well, of the many investigations that had been underway into Trump's activities, I suppose the one involving a porn star was going to be, at least in the minds of many, the least serious of.
I mean, it's salacious, but now that the indictment's been unsealed, it's oh so complicated to explain.
Yeah, well, in particular because it's sort of based on this novel legal theory, which is that he's been charged with falsifying business records, which usually is a misdemeanor. However, it gets upgraded to a felony if the business records are being falsified allegedly to essentially cover up some other crime, right? Now, what is that other crime? In theory, it would be campaign finance violations because, when we talk about the hush money that Trump allegedly paid to Stormy Daniels, the porn star, this money, under the prosecutor's theory, would essentially, it's essentially a campaign contribution. And so for that reason, since it was hush money, you're violating those rules.
Right. Again, it sounds rather complicated. Lila Jacinto, is Trump right in saying that this is not blind justice in this case, trying to build a case around something that might or might not be, according to Stacey here, a misdemeanor, not a felony?
Well, of course Trump would say that, but his lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, spent time in jail for these very charges. So, if you have to use the argument of justice for all, then surely Trump has to face justice as well. I mean, and he spun this to his advantage. Whether this, will be an advantage in the election in 2024, we can discuss that. But, he seized the narrative on this, and his diehard supporters are absolutely convinced that this is a case of the system going after him. But definitely, I mean, this is one of many cases that Trump is facing, and it is not the strongest case. But, let the court decide.
You mentioned whether he plays it to his advantage. Fact is, we're all talking about it right now. This week, a Republican strategist pointed to a study that found that if you monetized free airtime for candidates in the last election cycle, you'd be above the equivalent of $1 trillion. So you had those helicopter cameras following the president's every move from the airport to Trump Tower, from Trump Tower to the courthouse. Laurent Thomé, we're only talking about Trump, and he's the Republican frontrunner now.
Well, that
was before anyway, but
he, like you said, he's the front runner. He's going to run, so obviously everyone is going to want to cover the story. There's no question. He puts on a great show, especially surrounded by police, and his supporters see this as a witch hunt. So he will play this to his advantage, obviously.
Craig Kapitas, is this a good week for Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's a fantastic week. He's got the headlines. He's continuing his story. The American soap opera continues. Gets viewers. That's what it's all about for him.
It gets viewers. Are you surprised? When you think back to Election Day in 2020, people said, oh, now that he's lost, he'll fade away.
Americans love a good soap opera. It's not about the politics, it's about the show. And Trump puts on a fantastic show. He's a character without any character.
So is he formidable?
He'd make a good Pharaoh, I'll tell you that.
But is he formidable going ahead to 2024?
In the Republican Party, yes. I think the fluke of 2016 is not going to continue. He's alienated the middle. He's alienated a lot of people conservative. He's alienated a lot of his friends, but he has this lumpen 28 to 30% group of people, including a lot of very wealthy individuals who will support them, who will support him. And for the American, for this group, it
Why would
doesn't
those
matter.
wealthy Americans support him and not some other Republican candidate?
Because he's devoured them all. His hate and spite. You know, there's no accounting for hate and vitriol. This is what he's brought to the Republican Party. There's no shame. Look what happened in Tennessee, you know, with those kids getting, the young representatives getting thrown out of office for protesting guns, killing children. There's no shame anymore in the Republican Party. And I believe, or at least claim to believe, that it will implode on them at some point. It's just awful. There's no decency anymore. They've gone beyond the bounds of decency. I think it's hitting everyone, whether you're left or right. You know, enough, ça suffit.
All right, you mentioned what happened in Tennessee. Pushing Trump below the fold was Thursday's expulsion by Tennessee's Republican majority of 2 state representatives. They'd taken their call for stricter gun control after a recent mass shooting in Nashville to the floor of the Senate with a bullhorn. The pair are African Americans. A third representative who joined them, she survived expulsion by 1 vote. Gloria Johnson, well, happens to be white.
I 65-30 names.
Yes, and we're going to fight hard to get him back.
Why do you feel like there was a difference in the outcome?
I will answer your question. It might have to do with the color of our skin.
Please tell us more.
Stacey Mistry, it's if we talk about what Craig was, which is the spectacle of it all. So we have this spectacle in Tennessee, but suddenly the spectacle is no longer about gun control anymore. It's about race.
Yeah, well, as we see it again and again in American life, you have all of these issues being mixed together. In this case, gun rights and race relations, and the mix is rather combustive. Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult situation to deal with.
Will there be a recapture of the middle ground? And what are there lessons to be drawn in other countries from what's happening in America right now?
I think every country, at least in the West, with the expansion of social media, it's very easy to be polarized about any issue now. Everyone has a bullhorn they're using, and you see in France with the protests this week. Just everything gets amplified, and
I mean, but you know, with this Trump thing, I mean, part of the thing is, you know, the media realized that they created the Trump phenomenon in 2016. And they cannot seem to stop themselves. You know, we've got to follow this car down the Eastern Expressway. You know, there are journalists talking about whether they have their green pass to get into the court, etc. You know, we just cannot stop covering the American circus as a circus. And then somewhere with all this talk, we seem to actually be unable to draw back, which is, I mean, Trump.
So how do we do that? How do we draw back?
Well, I mean, drawback is looking at the stakes, right? The stakes are this is a likely candidate for the 2024 race. The primaries haven't gone as well, and you know, very likely there are probably Republicans who would like to see him go, but they just don't have the guts to come out and talk about it. But you know, where is American public opinion. We're sort of getting ahead of ourselves. There are many more cases coming up against Trump, but we covered it like O.J. Simpson.
Could this just be one moment in time, and come January when the primaries begin, it'll be very different?
No, it's not. It's our fault. Let's go behind the scenes. Francois and I this morning had a discussion. Do we really have to talk about Trump tonight? Well, yes, we do. Okay? But what's happened in America, and even we're guilty of this is a story, and Trump knows it. And he's going to do everything to fuel it. I've seen him do it up close and personal. Look, what Trump does is he plays the fates. Remember, he doesn't know a thing about Greek mythology, but some of our viewers might. There were 3 fates, and they controlled destiny. And that's where Trump has put his faith. It's what Norman Vincent Peale called the power of positive thinking, which is the book that Trump carries around with him. Now,
but he still didn't get reelected.
What?
He didn't get reelected.
It doesn't matter to him. You see, this is the fallacy, Lee. He is in it for the show. He's in it for the show.
But he's not in the White House.
It doesn't matter. He's making money. He's made over, close to $10 million since this, since 2 weeks ago, when he let loose with the lie that he was going to be indicted on Tuesday. Over that time period, he raised close to $2 million. He's brilliant. He is a character without any character. He is the consummate grifter. He's beautiful. He's 100% American. And the crowds love him. And the media, every one of us, we love him too. Is CNN going to stop covering it? MSNBC, Fox, France 24, the BBC? You going to stop covering tomorrow at AFP? The Journal isn't going to do it. I know we're not going to do it.
I believe we broke the Stormy Daniels story.
Exactly, you did.
The last time I checked.
I know. Most papers sold
Meanwhile, there is war in Europe going on, and it's about perhaps to get much worse. Ukraine's spring counteroffensive could be days away. So could the fall of Bakhmut, if you believe British intelligence. The eastern city, in part reduced to rubble. For months, it's been a meat grinder for both sides. Russia's advancing there. It's anyone's guess how a front line that's been mostly frozen during wintertime will evolve. This week, there was also a focus on Crimea with conflicting scenarios. The Washington Post publishing images of Russia digging in to fortify the peninsula, while one top aide to Ukraine's president hinting that the territory taken by Russia in 2014 could be in the mix if Kyiv recovers the rest of the country. Others in the entourage of Volodymyr Zelensky have since qualified and downplayed those remarks. Were, on the one hand, Laurent Thomé were watching the entertainment spectacle in the United States. On the other, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, we're having to deal with what's also a war of information.
Well, yes. Obviously, since the beginning, everyone is trying to win this war of information. Who's winning it? I mean, we're really being pitted, Western countries on one side and Russia and its friends on the other side.
I mean, it's increasingly coming down to Crimea, it appears.
But what does that mean, coming down to Crimea?
Well, there seems to be a lot of pressure, not, coming from Brazil, President Lula, as well, China, of course. That seems to be the talking point of, the ultimate test is how long and how far will the U.S. Keep supporting Ukraine. And we're actually where we were right at the start of this, which is, there's the talking point of Ukraine will set the terms. Ukraine's talking points is, the official line is still every inch of our territory. But there is incredible amount of pressure now talking about should Crimea be sacrificed in order to end this conflict. And I feel like Crimea will be the big battle that we're going to have to watch.
When you say battle, what do you mean?
I mean, the battle, before we actually get troops on the ground, the battle of the Western support for
of
Ukraine.
whether or not they...
That could be critical.
Craig Kapitas, is Ukraine ready to swap Crimea for the rest of its territory?
I don't think so. Not yet.
I don't think so, too.
No way. Not the ones I talked to. The crunch moment is we're getting to is, can this war be won without direct military involvement from NATO? And I think we're quickly approaching the crescendo, and the answer is no, it can't. Now, I've been speaking with a number of the folks who do the calculations, the estimates, and the proverbial bottom line is Ukraine's going to run out of men before Russia does. And the Russian way is attrition. They're just going to keep throwing bathroom sinks out of airplanes at them. Doesn't matter how they do it. They're not going to give this thing up. As you pointed out, they're building up this defensive wall in the Donbass and around Crimea. How are you going to take that out? Ukraine doesn't have the equipment to take that out. You need A-10 Warthogs, aircraft, which they don't have. They
got a pledge of all these Soviet-era MiG fighter jets from Poland this week.
A pledge? Wow. What are they going to get there? They need to be in the air now. I've been hearing this word pledge since last February. You go and talk to the Ukrainians, you know what they're going to tell you? We need it now. They've been saying that since last February, so I don't want to hear pledge anymore because I know the Ukrainians don't want to hear it. They need they need a couple of squadrons of A-10 Warthogs from NATO in the air right now taking out these installations. That's what they need to win. They're not getting it. Just not. And if they don't get it soon, the calculations are that they are going to lose simply because the Russians have more crap that they can throw at them than the Ukrainians can fight back with.
Right, and also the production capacity to keep up with this.
Well, at the same time, the Russians painting this as a war not with Ukraine, a special military operation in Ukraine, but a standoff with the United States and the West. And we saw this Friday espionage charges filed against the Wall Street Journal's accredited correspondent in Moscow, Evan Gershkovich. The White House says it still has no consular access to Gershkovich. In a throwback to the Cold War, he's being held again on these formal charges, which he denies. For its part, the Russian Foreign Ministry says it's considering consular access, but would be ignoring a letter from media organizations urging the 31-year-old's release.
Why should we react to the letter if we see their absolute hypocrisy? If people were engaged in supporting independent, free journalism, journalism as a profession, specific journalists, they would probably pay attention to the fact that a journalist has now died.
And that's an allusion to last Sunday's assassination of Vladen Tartarsky. Yes, there's plenty of attention on that front, as evidenced by the big billboards in Russian-occupied Donetsk celebrating Tatarsky, killed during a talk last Sunday in a St. Petersburg cafe. Stacey Mistry, this equivocation of this pro-Kremlin blogger with Evan Gershkovich, your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction is that they probably don't belong in the same sentence.
Bravo.
Evan is one of the finest journalists of his generation. He shouldn't have been detained in Russia because journalism, doing his job, is not a crime. I've got to know him a little bit over the course of the past year, and the thing that really stood out to me was that Evan had a remarkable understanding of Russia, a very nuanced understanding of the country. And it's really a shame for Russia that they've decided to arrest a journalist who was engaged in explaining the complexities of the country to a Western audience.
The day before he's arrested, a big spread that he co-wrote on how Russia's economy is starting to sour.
Yeah.
Was he arrested because he's a journalist or because he's American?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, it's one that we should really put to the Kremlin. You know, Evan is the son of Jewish immigrants who came to the U.S. from the Soviet Union. You know, he's lived in Russia for years, and in a way, he kind of considered it a second home. So in that respect, it's really tragic that a place that sort of became an adopted home for him has turned on him.
And before working at the Wall Street Journal, he worked at the French news agency AFP, Laurent Thomé.
Yeah, his arrest was obviously a big shock at AFP. But anytime a journalist gets arrested, killed, injured anywhere, you immediately worry about your colleagues, our own bureau in Moscow, and yeah, it came as a shock to us. Yeah, I got to edit some of his stories when he worked with us, and great journalist. So,
Craig Capitas.
I'd like to make a point here. You have two generations of Wall Street Journal reporters at this table. I was there when the Bancrofts owned it. You're there with Murdoch. We lived through similar situations with Danny Pearl.
Yeah.
During our time. And I think there's something that needs to be said for our viewers. I don't care who owns the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal reporters do not spy for any government. They are independent operators. The only people they're responsible to is the foreign desk and the reader. And that has been a constant at that paper since it was started. Doesn't matter who owns it. So this horseshit that we're hearing from Moscow, it's just what it is. And the constraint that I know a lot of current, former Journal reporters share, former and current Moscow reporters, Russia reporters share, is we can't really come out and tell you how we feel, because this is a very, very delicate situation that has to be handled delicately, obviously. But the bad news is that Putin's not going to pay one damn ounce of attention to what anyone says or does. He's going to put Evan through the mill, God forbid. And that's just untenable.
Lila Jacinto.
An unfortunate thing which seems to be happening. I mean, if you ask, was he detained because he was a Wall Street Journal or an American, as you said, only the Kremlin knows. But if Russia is going the way of Iran, which is to detain citizens in order to get a prisoner swap, we are in new terrain here. This was not something that Russia did. This we are used to with Iran. So this takes us on so many levels into very bad terrain.
A couple of weeks ago, China's president was in Moscow. Now it's Xi Jinping's turn to roll out the red carpet, not for Vladimir Putin. Last week it was Spain's prime minister. Now for France's president, Emmanuel Macron, on his first state visit to China since COVID. He came accompanied, but whereas Macron was greeted at the airport's VIP lounge by the foreign minister, a close friend of Xi Jinping, when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen arrived, she got the ecology minister at the regular passenger exit, as reported there by Politico. Laurent Thomé.
Yeah. What's wrong with the ecology minister?
Yeah, it's the Chinese government is very much into protocol. Macron is a head of state, so he will get the red carpet. But from those images, yes, it doesn't look great. But von der Leyen came in, before this trip, she and Macron had prepared for it together, and clearly they had this good cop, bad cop strategy where she was.
Did it work?
Well, did it work? If they were looking for an immediate response from China on the war in Ukraine, no. Xi Jinping was never going to say immediately, "Oh, sure, yes, I will get on the phone with Putin right now."
Of course, diplomacy maybe happens. In fairness, diplomacy perhaps happens best in the dark. it's what you say behind closed doors that matters.
Diplomacy in China only happens with the big dog, the top dog. If you're not talking to the top dog, you're not getting nothing in China. And Macron and his gang go in there dressed up like they've been costumed by the set director from Reservoir Dogs. Look how cool we are, but we're not going to get slaughtered. We're going to come back. We're going to fix this. What happens? They just treat him like a 3-day-old dumpling.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
I am.
She certainly prefers tea for two, Dateline Guangzhou, and an informal tete-a-tete that happened this Friday between the Chinese and French presidents at the Guangdong governor's residence. Southern China, place that matters, Stacey Mitri, because a lot of business is done in that part with the West, in that part of the country. And, you know, as is the case with these state visits, they announce all these deals and they come with all these business leaders in tow.
Yeah, exactly. And I believe Macron had a fairly large entourage of French CEOs moving with him, including the CEO of Airbus, who I believe is working on a new order from various Chinese airlines. Yeah, I mean, you know, they're also talking about opening a new factory in Tianjin, I think. So it sort of calls into question, you know, how far, whether the EU is really serious about, you know, decoupling with China. Obviously, that's been the line from Washington, trying to push the Europeans to take a more confrontational stance.
Well, just if I may, Stacey, at this point, the viewer's confused. On the one hand, we're talking about whether the West is supposed to read China the Riot Act over Ukraine, over trade. And on the other, you're coming with business leaders who are there to ink deals.
Yes, and that's why I also think it's interesting that Macron decided to bring von der Leyen with him. I mean, he's clearly connecting the question of Ukraine to Europe's trade relations with China. I mean, she doesn't tag along unless trade relations sort of hang in the balance, one would think. Of course, when you actually show up and meet with Chinese leadership, perhaps that's more of a sobering moment.
Mila Jacinto.
Honestly, I felt like I was in a time warp watching this. I have seen French presidential visits to China. It's the same pageantry. They travel with 30, 40, 50 French businessmen. They ink a deal, except that this is not 2015 and this is not 2009. I mean, Macron got instrumentalized by China, period. China wants Europe to decouple with the US. China wants to decouple politics from economics. You know, China wants to talk about trade and economics. China conducts economics in a very ideological way, but they simply want their trade partners to function like this. It's a free trade ride.
But there's been this wake-up call, Lila. We saw it with COVID, the fact that the Europe's leaders talked about being over-dependent on China. This talk last week about not decoupling,
de-risking.
But de-risking was the buzzword that came out of the high halls of power in Brussels.
But precisely, right? Precisely. We're talking about, we saw this dependence in 2020. It's 2023 and we seem to have forgotten that. So when are we going to have this moment? Look, this was the same argument that Angela Merkel kept talking about through the Nord Stream. You know, was like, oh, it's the economy. We've got to look out for our economics. And then, hello, we are way too dependent. So it's precisely the point.
Laurent Thomé, is Europe unaware? Or are they, I mean, how are they, this concept, for instance, of de-risking, is that just a nice way of trying to play both sides? What does it mean?
Maybe it's sort of a diet decoupling, I guess.
Decoupling, de-risking, what is it? Are we in a garage? Take care of the carburetor.
Von der Leyen told our reporters in an interview last month that de-risking means trying to diversify away from China, but it doesn't mean the end of economic relations with China.
You cannot de-risk, you cannot decouple. China has 23% of the world's population, ladies and gentlemen. They're a player whether you like it or not. If there's another serious banking failure, mortgage meltdown, the West is not going to be able to deal with it without China's help.
Craig, We've seen the conversation change out of Beijing, where at when he was elected for his third term, Xi Jinping talked security instead of economics.
Elected? You mean appointed?
Well, he was elected by the
Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, let's use our terminology.
Okay.
Words are important here.
At the same time, we're seeing expatriates who left China. They don't want to go back anymore.
Right. Well, that's fine. They don't have to go back.
They don't have to go back.
They don't have to go back. But look at the quality of people we're sending over. You know, I hate the expression, I'm old enough to remember. God, but I'm old enough to remember when Nixon went to China. I'm old enough to remember when Carter went to China. Hell, I covered it as a young reporter.
Okay, I'm old enough to remember when de Gaulle went to China. I mean,
no, but they actually did substantive things there. They had substantive, wise leaders. I don't see that here.
I think it's much harder to convince some people now to go work, foreigners to go work in China after what happened with COVID.
So is that China's problem or is that Europe's problem then?
It's more of a, I mean, both really. If Europe still wants to do business with China, they need to send European people there to do the work, and China wants to continue business with Europe, they need to be able to greet Europeans. But I think what COVID showed is that China can very quickly, in the snap of a finger, activate its authoritarian system to close down a whole province, city, neighborhoods.
But isn't that why, and this is, again, answering Leela's point here, isn't that why Europe this time may be serious about not putting all its eggs in one basket?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I mean, I think they and Russia also showed them that you. I mean, they've said, Europe has said it. Von der Leyen has said it. They want to do more business with like-minded countries. Russia showed that if you're too connected economically with a country like Russia, then you're going to run into problems. So they were trying to do the same with China on raw materials, hoping to find lithium in Europe, develop that, but that will take years to happen. Europe will still need lithium from China to develop its green technology, especially if it wants to meet its climate targets.
All right, expatriates may be fleeing China in droves, but France's president might want to come more often. Thousands of kilometers from the strikes and the rage against pension reform back at home, Emmanuel Macron greeted by students at Guangzhou's Sun Yat-sen University, giving him, well, a rock star welcome before a question-answer session where Macron took his defense of Western democracies and liberal values to something of an esoteric level.
But a mind that only has knowledge without critical thinking is not totally free, because then it would have a set of data and knowledge but not really know what to do with it. Or the mind would simply be an object of propaganda or a project that is not its own, and it would be subjected to a larger force than itself. So a critical mind is important precisely because it allows for a free and emancipated individual, and that's the very principle of humanism.
Laurent Thomé, what do Chinese people make of that statement?
I think it was actually pretty extraordinary that he was able to say those things, talking about critical thinking, free your mind, and to a young Chinese audience like that. My 3 years I was there, I don't remember head of state or government coming and talking to a university and making such statements.
Was it broadcast? I mean, back in 2009, when Barack Obama was in Shanghai, it was streamed on a local television station.
I have to admit, I don't know. I do remember that when I was there, you know, the state TV would broadcast what it wanted or what it was allowed to broadcast. But
honestly, I'm not surprised by this at all. I mean, you know, so he did a repeat of Barack Obama in 2009 at Cairo. Fine, but I never.
Shanghai, I'm talking about.
Oh, no. But this town hall, you know, do you remember Barack Obama addressed students at Cairo University? But I didn't for a minute think that any of those students would ask any questions that would come anywhere near something really hot or touchy.
They were all plants.
Well, there weren't many questions for starters, Stacey Mitri.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of remarkable to see him interacting with the students and in particular with the crowds outside. It doesn't seem like they had been briefed on the finer points of the 49.3. But yeah, it's quite the split screen between the reception he's getting in China versus the scenes of chaos on the streets of France.
Well, let's talk about what some think are scenes of chaos on the streets of Paris. One of Macron's rivals in last year's presidential election got a landslide win last Sunday. 89% of Parisians voting in a referendum to halt the capital's electric scooter sharing experiment. A victory for Mayor Anne Hidalgo, who fared dismally as the socialist candidate in 2022 with less than 2% of the vote nationally last year.
More than 100,000 voters. This is really very pleasing for democracy. It means that when our fellow citizens are asked to vote on issues that are relevant to their lives, and which can allow them to take back control of their lives, well, they turn out. And this is very, very good news.
They turn out. They didn't really turn out, did they? 7% of Parisians turned out.
Yes, but I mean, it's an extreme...
Did you turn out?
I did. I loved the opportunity for consultative democracy, to quote, to quote Anne Hidalgo, and why not? This is a city that has seen seething rage for 2.5 months, and and here is a local administration that is asking an opinion, and it is very telling that the trottinette manufacturers say that the people who voted against this are older, and you didn't have something online, so now we have young citizens who cannot cast their vote. They cannot go and, they can't exercise democracy. You need to make a video game out of this for them to participate. Why didn't they participate?
Stacey Mitri?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the turnout, 7%. I mean, traditionally, you'd want to see some sort of quorum maybe in place, so to be sure that there's enough interest in the vote in the first place in order for you to then decide to enforce its outcome. In this case, they've basically decided to let a passionate minority decide for the rest of the city whether or not we can ride scooters. So,
the problem rests with our feckless mayor Hidalgo. She is not a manager. She never has been a manager. This thing should have been managed and regulated from the day they said, we're bringing these scooters to Paris, which is a very effective way to get
around. Because that's the criticism that's been leveled, that it's not a question between yes and no, there's regulation.
Right, but that horse left the barn, mon ami.
Why?
Because it's over with. You have to put the regulations in place when it starts, and they never did. They never did. They just said, let it go. And this is Hidalgo's fault. She thought, this is going to just be fine, and now she has to backtrack. You have a lot of people out of work because of this. Trottinettes are a great idea. I always like them. Look, I drive a motorcycle, okay? I have rules and regulations I have to follow. They were in place. There were none in place for this, and that's the mayor's fault.
Copenhagen banned them in 2020, and then they brought them back, I think, a year later with stricter rules. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's not la fin.
I mean, they definitely need rules. They were a complete menace, and the streets in some parts of Paris were just piled with these trottinettes just thrown around.
In fairness to Hidalgo, though, they did introduce regulations, designating certain areas where you can park the scooters. In some cases, additional controls were introduced so that the scooter actually shuts down if you try to take it onto a sidewalk. And so Paris, interestingly, was sort of like a place to experiment and to develop these rules. And in many ways, it's a city that has been a model to other capitals. So the fact that Paris is now going to ban the scooters probably doesn't bode well for the industry as a whole.
And there's another very French aspect to all of this, Laurent Thomé. What is it? Some 2.5 million people live in the capital, but some 11 million live in the greater Paris area, perhaps more even, depending on how you count it. And the grievance is that those who use them are not necessarily residents of the capital itself.
I'm not a resident of the capital. I personally don't use them, but I mean, like Stacey was saying, 7%. That's I covered town meetings in Massachusetts. Town meetings, if you don't have 50% turnout, they can't vote on anything. Nothing will pass because you need.
True.
Yeah. So.
And interesting, the people who live in the banlieue and the outskirts of Paris, they didn't have a vote in this whole thing.
What, they don't have a vote of who's the Paris mayor?
On their bike.
This whole question of mobility, and it'll be the final point on this, Stacey Mitri. It's going to keep on cropping up now, especially in the run-up to next year, and Paris hosting the Olympics.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, you wanted to sort of foster an image of the city which is inclusive, and by inclusive I mean of the people who live just outside of the périphérique. It's always been a challenge for Paris, you know, this sort of drawbridge mentality where you have sort of a wealthier bourgeoisie who lives in the center of town, and then everyone on the outskirts who sort of gets left behind.
But they're also the ones who probably want to take their cars into Paris.
Possibly. They want to take their cars. That's getting more and more difficult, by the way. Scooters are getting tougher. It seems like it only works out if you're living within the
public transportation.
You know, the Chicago Mayor Daley once said a good mayor has to be able to manage and do much more than getting their third cousin a job in the basement at City Hall. And this is pretty much Anne Hidalgo's routine. She is not a good manager. Put the politics aside. She has messed up this city on every managerial front you can imagine.
I'm sorry, did you quote Mayor Daley as being the paragon?
No, Mayor Daley. Look, no one's perfect, Francois, but Mayor Daley knew how to run a city. He was a thug. You know, he wasn't a Mussolini, but he was a thug. But Mayor Daley knew how to manage Chicago. There are some, you know who knew how to manage Paris? Your favorite buddy, Chirac. Yeah, he was corrupt and all this and that, but you know, he at least knew how to manage something. Hidalgo couldn't manage a basket of eggs.
So you need to be a thug and corrupt.
Yes.
It sounds like this argument is going to run and run. Many thanks, Craig Capitas. I want to thank Laurent Thomé, Lila Jacinto, Stacey Mitri. Thank you for joining us here for The World This Week.